Hi everyone, my name is Ronaldo. Best of luck for the debate.
Hey, yeah, I'm Abhishek. All the best for the round.
Yeah, so best of luck to both teams. Before I start, could I ask one of my panelists to time keep the round? Like put time signals into the chat and stuff.
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ronaldo. Okay, without any further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open the case for the government side. Here.
Hi, just to make sure if I'm audible and visible.
Yes to both.
Okay. Gender pronouns she, her. I'll be taking POIs verbally, and I might take one around 5 minutes. And we'll start on my first word. Panel, the status quo is a world of inequity and of injustice. Progressive movements are lacking in awareness, while rich multinational corporations are getting all of the advertisement. We oppose this, so proud to stand on side proposition. The model of side proposition is extremely straightforward. We're going to make social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc., do several things. First, we're going to allow them to use their collection of information of users and their algorithms to push people who show interest and have tendency to show interest in progressive movements, these news feeds about progressive movements. This looks like pushing content about feminist movement advocacy projects, or a story of sexual abuse to someone who liked a post about the Me Too movement, or of a feminist post. But secondly, do note that this is not going to be publicly told. That is to say that we're not going to publish to the public that social media is actively doing these things and pushing that content on progressive movements on social media, that is essentially important. There are two things these are two things that we'll be doing, and I think Gov's side has the fiat to say that they're going to work. What specifically does progressive look like then? I think it looks like things like BLM or Me Too movement, or even environmentalist movements, where you have people speaking up and advocating for change in terms of issues that are not noticed or cared about in the past. This looks like feminist movements speaking up to get abortion rights again, or LGBTQ advocating for marriage. Given that, the news feeds will be giving them probably look like two things. First, it's probably going to be about the abuses or injustices that people are facing, and the consequences of structural problems, i.e. women being sexually assaulted, or people drowning in specific nations because of climate change. But secondly, it's also ways to initiate social change, i.e. meetings, feminist meetings where people can go to and take action, or links to donation. Given that, there's a bit of framing before my case. I think this debate is not about whether or not we should have targeted ads on social media. It's more about what content is going to be forwarded on these targeted ads that social media does have the incentive to forward on either side. You're going to have people paying these, I'll take one around 5 minutes, paying these companies to send propaganda and targeted ads on either side of the house, i.e. politicians like Donald Trump. This is not something that the government can control, and total ban under side opposition is impossible for two reasons. First, politicians in government does have the incentive to leverage social media for their own benefits, because they have no incentive to make social media ban targeted ads that can be used for their own propaganda. But secondly, social media and big tech companies have large amounts of social capital to lobby the gov to not care, i.e. Apple lobbying the Chinese government to ignore about the abuses happening in Foxconn. We say that social pressure does not matter anyways, because people are addicted to social media, and there's no way that public pressure can initiate change to the ban of targeted ads, i.e. people are literally lobbying Facebook on Facebook because they have no alternative at all. Given that, there's three things in my case. First, why we help progressive movements. Secondly, why our counterfactual is uniquely important, and thirdly, why it's also principally justified to do so. So first, how are we helping progressive movements? Do know that there are people suffering on the ground in the status quo because the state does not care about them, and people do not care about them. People like George Floyd facing police abuse, or a lot of women who are scared to voice out for things like rape because of prominent social narratives. There are three reasons as to why our model is able to help. First, progressive movement in the status quo do not have capital to manipulate media. Like feminist movement or like racial minority do not have the money to leverage social media and like try to like lobby them to like send targeted ads in the status quo. In the status quo, only the powerful people like politicians in the government have like the power to manipulate social media. I'll explain why that's problematic later on in my speech. So under our side, I think we're firstly able to uniquely get more people to see that information, which you don't get in the past, because like we have the fiat to make social media companies actively send progressive information that you don't get under their side, because these minorities, because of structural problems, are unable to like climb up the social ladder and have the capital to manipulate social media in the first place. But secondly, you're able to find targeted people who are willing to help out. Like I think you have higher likelihood to take actual action and initiate change because you're not always blinded by advocacy and a certain echo chamber, where it's extremely hard to find the people who actually care. Under our side, you have social media platforms who are actively looking at like people who probably are interested in social media, like social movements, progressive movements in the past, through tracking down the news feeds that they like watch and target those people to send them like information about progressive movement. So you're actively catering to the people who are most likely to initiate change and like donate to institutions like BPW to like help feminist movements, or like help like female refugees and stuff like that. But third, there is a rise in populism in the status quo, which means the government does have active incentive to like scapegoat on the minority, like women or LGBTQ. Social media perpetuates that right now because like after this, social media perpetuates that right now because like you have governments who are actively paying them and lobbying them to send targeted ads, i.e. Donald Trump like sending like ads or advocating about how like refugees are all bad and they should be kicked out of the United States on social media. Under our side, you have like targeted ads on progressive movements to counterbalance that under our side. I'll take the POI.
You have spent 5.5 minutes not defending your case because what your motto tells us is we will recommend similar content of interest to every user. That's already what social media is doing. Are you willing to defend a world where you are actually trying to eradicate more conservative content and promote more progressive content, which is our true stance in this debate?
Yeah, we're willing to defend that. And I think our case already tells you about that. But secondly, I think our model is able to work because in the status quo, like despite you having like social media algorithms, like the progressive movements don't have the capital to like actually leverage social media to send targeted ads, and like social media does not have the active incentive to care about and actively advocate for social change. So moving on to like the last mech that we give you is a rise in populism, and under our side, where you have counterbalance to to push back the narratives of like that you have in the status quo. The impact here is twofold. First, you get more awareness of problems right now because the prerequisite to initiating change is that people know about what's happening. So we give more exposure. And I think it's especially important in terms of people who are facing abuse to not let them internalize their harms, because oftentimes they don't know it's the structure's fault, therefore opt into self-doubt and don't have are unable to or scared to voice out. But secondly, you at least get more social discourse and spotlight because like even if we're sending it to everyone, at least more people knows about the problem. But secondly, why does their counterfactual suck? Do you know that things like social media algorithms are symmetric? So under their side, there's probably still going to be targeted ads, but you don't have anything to counterbalance that out, and people are stuck in an echo chamber. But lastly, I think it's principally justified because like people acknowledge algorithms in social media, and on a utilitarian standpoint, you get better outcomes. Thus, for all the reasons above, never prouder to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that speech, and I'd like to invite the Leader of Opposition to continue open the case for the opposition side. Here.
Hi, just checking if I can be heard.
Yep, loud and clear.
Nice, thank you. I'll try to take a POI at also around 5. If I fail to do so, I'll try to take you before 6. And I would prefer POIs if you can just shout it out. I don't take POIs in chat, thanks very much. The preferred gender pronoun would be he or him. And without further ado, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Go. Note that proposition never fulfilled their burden in this debate. Their burden is to push for a world where they disproportionately advertise for things like progressive content. Their role is never to talk about how they counteract the skeptical perpetuation of scapegoating of minorities and females. I think they never fulfilled their burden. That is why proposition fails in their debate. Proposition's first argument is that minorities have no alternative to voice out, and therefore you have to help progressive movements voice out by doing this. I have 3 rebuttals and to talk about why this is untrue. First, we think individuals are becoming more and more progressive because they already see the suffering of minorities and women. This is a false characterization that they ran on the side of the house. They said that you are unable to see these things. You're only uniquely able to see things that rich politicians and rich multinational companies advertise. I would posit that these things still stand on their side of the house because media companies have profit incentives. So if one entity or one organization is willing to pay you a huge sum of money for advertising their materials, I think media companies will still take this offer. But note that under their side of the house, we think it's unclear why this policy is necessary. This is because video footages of hate crimes, LGBTQs getting abused, are the most graphically thought-provoking footages. These are the video footages, these are the discussion forums where they get the social discourse. This is because these are the most controversial issues in this society. These get the most discussion and therefore naturally get more views. So I think it's unclear as to why these don't get exposure in the status quo. For instance, the George Floyd case is already reported extensively by the mainstream media, which can trigger people's anger and empathy to fight for change. We're not saying that this is a bad thing. We're saying this is a good thing. This is already happening. So it's unclear why they have to disproportionately push for more progressive content that are currently still being reported in the status quo. Second of all, in the status quo, people can already share their liberal thoughts on social media to their friends and family members. So it's unclear why they can't do that on our side of the house. But third of all, know that they create a bigger echo chamber that they aim to take down. Part of their argument addresses how there's an already existing echo chamber. But in my argument, I will be explaining why conservatives opt to other platforms, and therefore you create much more polarization, you create much more echo chambers, and there's no possibility of social discourse and why that is harmful. And lastly, I just want to take down the principally justified argument. That is not even an argument, let's be honest. This argument never explained why this is principally justified. They just said, according to utilitarian metrics. But no, they have to tell us why unutility, this is net beneficial to society, as opposed to just throwing a utilitarian argument at us. So this is non-existent. Their second speaker have to fill this logical gap. On to my first argument. I have an actual principle argument on why you, as social media platforms, have the obligation to accommodate multiple different and diverse ideologies. First of all, we would know that in the status quo, there's a heavy stigmatization of conservatism. But the core ideology of conservatism is social stability, which also matters equally. We think elderly couples living with little welfare and finding it hard to survive in the age of inflation is just as legitimate as pride parades reaching for more social recognition. Actually, we would posit that the issues that conservatives care about, such as the elderly issues, not getting enough money to survive on a day-to-day basis and living paycheck to paycheck, these things typically get least exposure. First, because the elderly don't know how to use social media. Second, because people don't care about them in the status quo. It's because people care more about the progressive context, which we think is okay. But the fact of the matter is, they're already not getting exposure. Under their side of the house, they're completely wiping out conservatism on these medias and acknowledging any possibility for these issues to ever get covered on social media. So I think that's naturally something that we don't want to see under both sides of the house. Our argument is that all ideologies matter equally and the choice should be left to people to decide, not designers of media platforms. Each person should have their own preferences, and their preferences should be supported by the platform, not manipulated by the platform. If they want to say that progressive content matters more, they have to prove to us why it's an overwhelming social benefit rather than a non-existent benefit that kind of already exists in the status quo, right? Perhaps many events don't fall either on the conservative or progressive spectrum. So they have to explain to us why they're shoving these events into the progressive spectrum. So they're using things like progressive media sources to report events that aren't conservative or progressive in nature. They're making these events progressive by nature. So we don't understand why they're doing this. We think this is naturally bad because it means that you create more polarization. This means that you create more manipulation and coercion on the behalf of social media platforms. Our second argument is that they create more echo chambers and polarization. The premise of this argument is that conservatives aren't bigots, as they are framed in the status quo popular culture. conservatives have technocrats and experts to help win elections for the conservative nominees. They are going to find out about the manipulation because number one, conservatives keep getting content on their feeds that they don't want, so they naturally develop skepticism and share their doubts about the feeds with families and friends and other conservatives groups that are influenced in the society. Second, they're academians surveying the exposure of information on social media. Therefore, they're very likely to find out about the trend of manipulation, given that these are people who are data experts who also work for the conservative nominees. Hence, there are two reasons why conservatives exit the social media and transfer to other platforms. The first reason is that conservative leaders like Donald Trump will call out these platforms as being rigged, as being controlled by liberals. They create other alternative platforms for the conservatives, such as Truth. These platforms are in the name of conservatives. They create propaganda such as, we are offering you a safe house for the conservative people of America. This is the Truth platform, for instance, that Trump recently created. Second, even if conservative leaders don't call such platforms out, conservatives don't like the progressive dumps. So they're very likely to just quit and use other alternatives. So even if you don't like the Truth platform that Trump created, you have no alternative but to opt to these platforms, given that you feel rigged, you feel angry about the fact that you're being manipulation, about the fact that your information is being filtered out, that it's not the information that you want to see. So even if there's conservative people on both sides of the house, on their side, the conservatives are far more likely to be angry and polarized. So this is bad because they feel manipulated by the progressive group and have significantly less trust toward any of the other social movements. Moreover, even if when they're locked within these platforms, we think there's much more echo chamber. There's much more concentration of only conservative ideologies and no exposure to progressive thoughts in this at all. In the status quo, there's at least media discourse because you're mixed together with progressive people. Even if you're getting the most of the time conservative ideologies, we still think you're most likely going to deal and interact with other progressive people. So you're likely to get exposure to their thoughts. So this has several impacts. First, more social backlash. The heavily conservatives do more crazy things, such as publicly terrorizing Black communities with gun patrols, and mildly conservatives not accepting any other ideologies and accepting leaders like Donald Trump. There exists a spectrum of conservatism. Even if the mildly conservatives question Donald Trump's authority in the status quo, they're unlikely to do so at the point of which they have no alternatives. Second of all, also note that if their goal is to get more moderates, then that demolishes under their house because it's harder for them to believe in these social medias and the things that they're being fed into. So because of all these reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the leader of opposition for that speech. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the government side. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
I prefer POS in the chat, so please do not prolong me verbally. And wait 1 sec. I prefer hearing your pronouns. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, in the status quo, conservative individuals are not stigmatized. The individuals are the vast majority of capital in status quo. We do agree that supportive of LGBTQ policies are generally seen as morally correct in status quo, and progressive individuals supposedly care more about human rights. However, in the status quo, policies against neutral and minority people are so extremely lacking, and minority people are so silenced. We believe that the entire characterization, the option I paint to, is extremely false. So proud to oppose. Several observations we have gone to rebuttals. Firstly, I think at the end of the day, opposition failed to tell you what the alternative is under the House. The alternative, like for example, Donald Trump using political propaganda, but also like for example under the House, there's going to be YouTube ads like games or Wix.com, right? These are also ads that we do not support because we don't really see how these multinational corporations are going to have an active incentive to post these content, and it's going to be beneficial for society. We also do want to note that we don't really want to make this debate necessarily into progressive content versus conservative content. We do agree that some somewhat of conservative content is beneficial. However, we're going to post predominantly conservative content, and we do completely agree with deny the other gaming content, for example, like Fortnite under the House. Secondly, what exactly stands up of proposition. We do support pushing progressivism to everybody. But the difference is, if you show complete denial to progressive content, then you won't get the content. The difference in the House is on our side, we're more likely to push progressive content to the neutral individuals or even to the conservative people who are in extreme denial or progressive content. We're still going to push the vast majority progressive content to the vast majority of people. 30. I think the entire picture the opposition trying to paint on the House is extremely false. Conservative individuals in status quo are not stigmatized. That is not true. Even though supporters of LGBTQ people are seen as morally correct, conservatives to control the vast majority of social capital. They dominate over the vast majority of policies and in control for the mass majority of power in the status quo. So the entire picture that Kevin trying to paint to you on the House is really not true, right? So several rebuttals then against the bulk of the case. Firstly, on the argument against polarization, I don't think this debate is really about like the mutual existence and our the House, company polarization, company our side. And this debate really is about the polarization of the House, company total domination on their side to a certain extent. The reason that's true is because even though BLM movement is one successful movement, which really extremely like targeted and very specific, because the movement does rely on the filming of one person dying and very graphic content. However, there's thousands of people dying that every day, and a lot of them lacks active the vast majority of minorities are getting actively abused in status quo, lacks the media coverage on them, right? So even though BLM movement is quite successful, it's going to be unfair to prove that that means that conservative, say progressive movement status quo are very successful. The vast majority of progressive movement status quo are failing. LGBTQ people are still getting discriminated against the workforce. Women are still getting stigmatized in status quo as being abused in the workforce. They don't have equal forces, they don't have equal rights to nearly to some extent, right? So because of that side, I think it's unfair for our opponent to tell you that progressivism have the same extent of power to conservatism when the vast majority of individuals in status quo do support conservative content, and the conservative individuals still control the vast majority of social capital. So in the case, they're trying to paint conservatism as like very weak in status quo, and like they will go to other platforms and polarize. We do agree that polarization works on our side for certain extents, but on their side, the conservative are far more likely not that the social capital to actively lobby for these social media groups to only post the vast majority of conservative content. Like for example, Donald Trump being the one that has the vast majority of voice on Twitter compared to conservatives as progressive leaders because that's more social capital comparatively. And this argument really does not make sense. In fact, the conservative individuals and progressive people have nearly extent on the side. The majority on this, the House and minority have nearly the same extent power on their side. Secondly, we also tell you, Slacktivism means that you need people to actually push it, because as the trend goes out, people stop reposting them. For example, the Me Too movement, after the trend goes out, Me Too movement will probably die, right? So without an advertisement or the House, well, like the movements on the progressive movements and there's the House, are they going to die really quickly because of the news advertisement that would support the trend and give it to more people? The trend will die down on Twitter, for example, and the entire trend on the Me Too movement will eventually die out. This is already happening in status quo. Secondly, on building newer social media platforms for the conservative people, we saw several things here. Number one, this argument in itself is extremely unlikely, right? Because even if you can get things, for example, on Trump, people are still addicted. The reason that's so is because their algorithm get addicted because you only see, because on our side of the House, you not only see the progressive content, also like basketball bits or TikTok dances, right? It's really unlikely that people will really, just because of several progressive ads, go to completely new websites. They're not nearly asked about the social media and stuff like that anyways, and stop all like opposing programs. The reason that people use social media movements or like programs in the first place aren't to actively look at the advertisement the site is giving you, is to use a progress, for example, Facebook, to chat with their friends. So the entire idea that people necessarily quit this movement and quit all social media or to go to other movements or go to other social media to increase polarization really doesn't make sense. Before I move to the rest of my rebuttals, yes.
Sure. Gen Z don't care about the elderly and conservatives. They're all very radical progressives, and as more young people dominate social economic output, there's very little space for the conservatives to survive. But even if conservative people is dominating, this proves that your policy won't work. Because if people already have entrenched conservative bias, then this policy won't change their mind, but rather it only makes them more angry. So your characterization setup is false, right?
Firstly, progressive people are like more spread through to Gen Z individuals, but conservative more control over the vast majority of policies, and the people who are in power are more conservative comparatively. Secondly, I think we do agree that for extreme conservative individuals, we're not going to change those. But our opponent cannot paint this debate as the black and white. We do agree that in somewhat the progressive individuals are going to be like very progressive people are not going to be changed in our house. However, the neutral individuals who don't really have like the extreme conservative ideology and are not really swayed by aggressive ideologies either, they're far more likely not going to change them. However, not very black and white fallacy that we don't really agree with. Secondly, then, they would also tell you there are other alternatives. For example, people legit there are no other alternative, right? People literally boycotted Facebook on Facebook. So it's very unlikely that there's going to be newer social media platforms that conservative turn to anyways. Thirdly, under There's the House is the same because no conservative people are also annoyed by these things like Cambridge Analytica. So we tell them There's the House, they're going to have the same amount of problems with the conservative individuals. At the end of the day, we tell this policy is justified because on There's the House is more likely going to be domination for the conservative individuals because they're wanting control of the social capital and the politicians. Secondly, we tell this policy is not going to lead to polarization because we are unlikely going to quit the social media platforms simply because the targeted ads they don't like and going to quit all the other functions. Because of that, we're so proud to propose.
I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for opposition side. Here.
Great. I just want to make sure, can I be heard and seen clearly?
Yes to both.
Right. I'll be preferring verbal POIs, gender pronouns he, him, and let me get my timer ready. All right. My time starts now. Panel, at the top of my speech, I want to clearly pin down that this debate was never one asking what proposition is asking. This debate was never asking whether we should be ignorant or not, whether we should try to help and spur social development or not. This debate has always been asking whether we want to strive for perfection, whether we want to brainlessly glorify some policy that seems perfect in the first place that actually has a huge amount of feasibility problems when carries out, or whether we will have enough ambition to actually work out for a real solution, whether we want to trust the status quo, whether we want to trust the rise of popularism and liberalism. Several things in my speech. First of all, let's tackle Prime Minister's motto and their framing. First, let's note that this House believes that motion. So I don't think that they have the fiat to automatically assume that every one of their policies has a 100% accuracy when carried out. We can give them the fiat to say that this policy will be implemented, but we cannot give them the fiat to say that this policy will suffer no rejection, no kind of obstacle risen from the Conservative Party that they claim to be so powerful with so much capital, with so much resources. In fact, we believe that their characterization has a very single premise that is wrong. Because if the Conservative Party is truly manipulating and dominating the whole liberal world right now, then we wouldn't see the discussion of this policy being carried out. Even if the policy on their side gets a fiat to be implemented in the first place, I'm pretty sure that according to their characterization, the conservative people have enough ability to clean out every single kind of harm that their kind of policy will bring to them. The second thing you have to note is that they look at their policy. They're literally not defending anything because I quote from the Prime Minister, "We are going to recommend feminist content to people who already participated in Me Too movement." That is simply what social media is doing right now. That is not their stance. That is why you have to take their second speaker's proposal, which means that except for the extremists, which I'm not sure how they filter out the extremists, but let's say that they filtered out the extremists, they're going to have to send progressive content and filter out conservative content to every other person. That is what they have to defend for any impact to take charge. Third of all, note the second line of Prime Minister's policy, we're not going to publicly announce it to anybody, is extremely wavery. Because my first speaker already characterized to you why conservatives are not idiots, right? Presumably, according to their characterization, conservatives are also going to have targeted ads. They're also going to hire academicians who are going to be professionally characterizing their stance and professionally talking to people about why conservatism is actually acceptable. So in that case, we think that the conservatives see that their academicians have a severely damaged popularity all of a sudden on every single social media platform. It is pretty easy for them to recognize that what policy is being implemented. So I don't think their second line of the policy is going to make any impact impact at all. I'm going to extend on that later. But first of all, the second question on that, let's talk about the status quo and our alternative. Note that Chingwei and Albert's core thesis to why conservatives are dominating the social media market right now is that, quote, they have capital, they have money, they have policies, they have resources. But that is exactly why we are using social media right now, because social media is the first platform that does not necessitate money for your voice to be heard. It's the first platform where you as a regular civilian with an iPhone or with a computer are able to send your voice out on the internet and have millions and billions of people respond to you. I am not sure why in social media money is the precedent necessity to having a voice. I don't think that their characterization of the minority of conservatives having a lot of money is going to work out on social media, because social media is fundamentally not a clash on capital but a clash on popularity, i.e. that is why we see in the status quo we have Me Too, we have BLM regaining so much popularity, even if presumably according to their characterization no billionaire is willing to join that side. We are still going to see popularity. Their characterization is just extremely off the topic. But even if you don't buy that, let's look at realistic things, right? Because we would see that the most important or the most popular topics in social media are, as example, BLM, are as example Me Too. We are not sure why they can tell you that in the status quo we have like seen so much depression, quote, on social media, while they are literally the most important topics on social media. But moreover, note crucially that whatever they tell you, like on the wipeouts of conservative platforms, actually I'm going to address that later. But moreover, even if you don't believe the status quo, at least you can note that in the status quo, the majority of the teenagers have liberal and progressive point of views, and that is why in the very worst case on our stance, at least we have the mindset of progressivism, and presumably if their case stands that the rich people, the conservatives, are rich because they have been spending more time in society, that will be changing in the worst case in about a decade. But let's take their case at its best, because note that if their case actually has zero liberalism and tells us that popularism is just absolutely oppressed, that none of their policies is going to work. So at best, it's a balance out on their case and on our case, and that has no impact at all. So I think we should use the case that is actually realistic, a case that thinks that popularism thoughts and liberalism are currently the majority trend on social media. Also, note about our counterfactual in the status quo then, right? Because we have already told you that currently most people are willing to stand for BLM as example. Most people are willing to accept that feminism or LGBTQ communities are morally acceptable. And that is why we're absolutely willing to stand for a stance, or we just continue to enunciate the voices on social media. The trend has been positive. It will be positive in the future. The next question then on polarization. Our first logic is that conservatives will switch to another platform, and that is more polarization. They just tell you conservatives have friends on all platforms. No, presumably, if you have a strong political opinion about conservatism, most of your friends are going to be conservatives as well. So in that case, most conservatives, just with their friends, together switch to a new platform. My first speaker analyzed to you a realistic example of Trump's platform called Truth, and that is literally a new social platform for conservatives to polarize more. But second of all, note crucially that in the worst case scenario on our case, they still anger conservatives. That means that on their side, they get not less conservatism, but more angry conservatives. And we have proven to you why that leads to easily more extremism. But third of all, let's talk to the appeal to the neutral groups, right? Two logic links in this. First of all, the conservatives has way more weapons on their sides, because in that case, on their side, they're actively depriving conservatives of some rights. So now what will conservatives say? They'll say that progressive people are violating the First Amendments, literally. That means that more people are inclined to believe the conservative parties on their side. Second of all, note crucially that in most cases, we think that the people don't like to being told what to do. I.e., if I have been told around my society that currently most social media platforms are filled with progressive thoughts, I'd be more careful in believing progressive thoughts if I enter the social media platforms. So their side actually diminishes progressive credibility. But lastly, I just want to quickly remark that the spurring of true discussion was never based on consensus. Because if I agree to you, then the argumentation stops there. It is only when I disagree with you that you'll try to find evidence, warranting, logic links, and impacts to try to persuade me. Because we think that only in a world where social media has both conservatives and progressive people, that they'll actually discuss, they'll actually find the effort to try to give more evidence and warranting and spur true activism, spur true equality. It is for all these reasons we're so proud to stand on opposition.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. Now I'd like to invite the government whip to continue the case from government side. Hear, hear.
Just to make sure I'm audible.
Yeah, but there's an echo behind you. Can you try again?
Am I audible?
Okay, now you're better. Yeah, you're audible.
All right, so wait for me for a second. I need to start the timer. All right, so I guess my speech will start with my first word. Three clarifications before I start on voting issues. Firstly, panel, do note that they mischaracterized status quo. Two clarifications on this point. Firstly, do note that social movements are not prominent in status quo. There are still millions of people who are scared to voice up. The problem of things like Me Too and BLM is that the time frame of you having popularity is extremely limited. In status quo, you don't see protests for BLM in comparison to the past things like, for example, scoutism, where people just repost and do not do any actions, means that you need someone constantly reminding them. I think when they literally only including BLM and Me Too. I don't think that's sufficient, right? I think most of the times looks like, for example, LGBTQ movements in, for example, relatively conservative countries where you're literally just beaten to death simply for the fact that you're homosexual. I don't see in the status quo social movements are actually like perfectly fine. We don't need any progress anyways, as your first speaker say, right? But secondly, do note that capital is important on social media. The fact that minority are able to post does not mean they get seen. You do see people lobbying these countries to silence up the minorities and censoring to that into things that's so-called bad for the government or politicians having the money disproportionately advertise or buying your personal information or spread propaganda. Second, they tell you why in social media money is like they don't think money is perceived as having a voice. But I think on either side of the house, both progressive and conservative people do have voice. The problem is targeted ads, which is the thing that lets you get seen by more people, essentially takes money. Minority movements do not have the resources to pay social media in order for the news to be carried out. So on their side, there's going to be no progressive content or ads essentially because their lack of social capital to pay the social media, put their ads on the platform, literally means that they're going to be silenced. Third thing about fiat, I think this is a value motion, so it's not about whether this motion is implemented will be beneficial for society or not. So feasibility is a legit clash. The only reason this motion takes sense is if we already carry out this policy, is going to be more good or not. Feasibility is something that's assumed in value motions. Noting that, several clash points. First, I think, again, characterization of status quo is truly fruited. I think there are two things. Firstly, I think essentially conservative are not stigmatized, as they say. Conservative individuals are essentially in control of political positions mostly. I do believe that progressive people are nowhere, progressive content are nowhere close to controlling society in the status quo. But second, do know, again, the mistake makes characterize the problem of status quo. I think it is simply not realistic for them to say that the problem is already solved in status quo. Second, then on principle, they say that you should help everyone in social media. I'll give you an example, for example, elderly. I think there are three things. First, it is unfair to us as to why elderly have more exposure on their side, because as Kevin concedes, the elderly don't have phones anyway, so it's symmetric. Second, their case at best is a wash, because they can also never explain to you why you give everyone a say on social media on their side either. As being already told you, you have targeted ads on their side to coming from governments and politicians. There are things things like populism, for example, where Donald Trump literally scapegoats on refugees to target ads on social media. That is to say, not everyone is going to have a say on either side. Thirdly, I think it's uniquely better on the side gov because you're pushing forward progressive movements which are inherently better than things like populism because at least you don't scapegoat on minorities. Thirdly, then, I think the only substantive power measured by opposition at the end of the day is that firstly, conservative people, the extremely conservative people get pissed off after they see these content. Secondly, they're going to do nasty things. I think there are three things. First, I do, as Albert says, I do agree that it is the case for extremely conservative people. I don't think they will necessarily change their view when they see the post, but I think that this is essentially not the people we're trying to target, right? Because on either side of the house, those extremely conservative people are not going to change their mind anyways. They're still going to post, for example, hate speech, no matter if essentially no matter what you do, they're going to post these things, right? But secondly, I think the extent does not really matter for them. They just generally hate the idea. They just literally hate the idea of progressive movement. I think that the very action of, for example, trying to post progressive content, progressive movements to more people, I think that will not necessarily change anything they think. Even if you don't post progressive content largely, they're still going to post hate speech as you see in status quo. But thirdly, as Albert said, I think the main topic in this debate is people in the middle. are, for example, people who like have a basic understanding of what progressive movements are, but either like, for example, do not have a more comprehensive understanding of what is the status quo, or for example, do not have a more comprehensive understanding of what this looks like, what your life looks like, or third, is not actually actively working towards, for example, making contributions. I think as Tim already explained to you, I believe that our model completely solves this problem, right? Because we give you two things. Firstly, I believe more generally it looks like more availability and more understanding or more exposure on a larger basis. And secondly, I believe Chinua has already characterized to you. I believe it more oftentimes looks like appealing for more support. Thirdly, I think just as I said, I think it is essentially solving the most crucial problem in social media. I think also in society as a whole, that is minority groups essentially do not have the capital to voice up, for example, or basically to target to actively combat against what you currently see in conservative groups, which are literally just using money or capital to silence up what you say. I think essentially on their side, you don't get say. The side on government is comparatively much better. Fourthly, they say that conservative people switch to a new platform. I think I already did a good enough job to explain to you why this is not true. I think there are two things. First, I think the reason individuals use platforms is not to look at targeted ads. I think it is use the platforms of these platforms, for example, talking with friends on Facebook or posts or posting things yourself. If you don't believe in progressive movements, you'll just ignore these ads. It will not prevent you from using Facebook anyways, right? You're addicted to Facebook because you're addicted to its algorithm. I think that it will not just like magically, you will just give up Facebook anyways. Only those who really are intrigued by the title will go. Second, I find it unlikely that just because of targeted ads, which is the best case scenario of our opponent, they don't care about anyways, or they just switch to another platform. At their best, if they don't sway opinions, they're likely just going to ignore the content because they are intrigued by the title. That is the reason to why, for example, Trump's new platform does not have a lot of users. Like people are boycotting Facebook on Facebook on populist ads, no real action is taken. I think the reason here is that these platforms are very dominant over the internet and alternative is far less powerful. But fourthly, what is on the ground benefits in our world? We uniquely get more exposure, even extremely conservative people see it. First, as Chinua tells you, the reason as to why you don't get change the status quo is that victims are scared to voice up for themselves. It is really hard to mobilize change. It's for this reason that victimizers internalize harms and opt into self-blame because they don't understand that it's the system's fault. The most important part of our case is that you have these ads to actually tell these people that other people are facing the same thing and it's not their fault. I think this is unique to our side because you don't get exposure when things that need to fade out and people don't actually help because of virtual signing. Second, I believe it's more social discourse, right? If conservatives hate these ads and argue on it, I believe that simply at least more people will see and there will be at least more exposure. Right? I think it is not actually any substantial harm, right? Even if you take our worst case scenario, even if you just take that, for example, conservative people, or for example, people in the middle ground are not going to believe or just adversely change their opinions. I believe that at least when you have more availability, when you have more actually reaching to more people and picturing to them what the thing is nice as well, I think that's just uniquely more beneficial. I don't see where is the substantive harm because essentially when conservative, when they say that very conservative extreme people are not going to believe you anyway, I don't think that's unique on our side anyways. Based on reasons that are power.
I'd like to thank the government whip for that speech. Now I'd like to invite the opposition whip to continue the case for opposition side. Here.
You guys can hear and see me, right?
Yeah, loud and clear.
All right, great. Viewers in chat, she, her pronouns, time starts in 3, 2, 1. On their side, conservative people are seen as the truth and progressives are seen as calculated manipulators because conservatives are not the ones who are entrenching everyone's explore pages from the root. And therefore, conservatives on their side are going to be far more angry and far more extreme because they're literally told that the social media that you're using every single day is manipulated by your political opponent, by the people who are against your ideologies, and by the people who are against you. But secondly, they had to explain why they manipulate the platform so every social media source they recommend is very disproportionately progressive. They never did this, so they never fulfilled their burden given by the CAP. On to the first clash point then on why this won't work. We've already explained why people will find out. There's 2 reasons why. First, Once you guys start to do this, then conservative users will feel uneasy and will feel pissed off because now their explore pages are radically different than before, right? And also people are going, because they feel more uneasy, because they don't know for sure, people are going to start speaking up about how their For You pages are so different right now. They share with other people, and therefore it will be found out, or because therefore there's going to be scandals about this actually happening in the first place, right? But second, a lot of academicians or like parties, they still use money to fund professors to do research on like what people are seeing on social media, right? It's likely that they're going to see a pattern of an increase in liberalness in social media, as Kevin has already explained to you from our framing of this debate. Then they said that politicians have a lot of incentive to lobby to make social media companies manipulate the pages already, and therefore this debate is about which ads are targeted more. I think first thing, their framing of this motion was already wrong from the beginning, because even though it's possible to pay to make certain ads more popular, the same goes for liberals who can pay for the exact same thing, right? There's literally no reason as to why the conservative people are going to do it substantially more just because they're older, right? But second, let's take them at their best and say that they do dominate. I think that even if conservative people are dominating, this proves that their policy isn't going to work, right? Because this just proves that if they don't lobby, they just pay for certain posts, and that will be seen they're going to always be seen by more people on both sides of the house, and therefore they don't have any impact. Also, if these people are just so radical, then it also won't work, because when people see progressive content, when conservative people see progressive content, they won't immediately be like, oh, I was wrong for like the last 40 years of my life, and abortion should actually be legal because of this like Instagram infographic, right? But either way, oh my God, they're literally strawmanning us, because guys, Joe Biden is literally the president of the United States. How can they like just say that conservatives are controlling everything that we see, right? Also, the younger generation is already becoming more and more liberal and believing in liberal values, right? They absolutely had to take us at best, or at least at equal, in order to win this debate. They cannot just claim that like, oh, if you're old, then you have more money. But they obviously didn't do that, and the Gov Whip already just ended, so already they like pretty much lose this debate. But let's take them at best. Let's go to the second clash and let's talk about echo chambers and if they actually solve this problem. They said that the prop says that minorities have no ability to voice out what they want to say. This is untrue for two reasons. First, individuals are already becoming more and more progressive because they see the suffering of minorities and women, right? For example, George Floyd is already reported extensively by the mainstream media, who can always trigger people's anger and empathy to fight for change. For people in the middle, they probably already saw like this trend of social movements towards liberalism. And also, I want to make it very clear, not everyone is extreme. Not everyone will still be racist. Well, not everyone will completely believe in racism when they see like a white officer like standing on like a black man's neck, right? But second, in the status quo, people can also share their liberal thoughts on social media, especially to their friends and to the family members and to people that are close to them, right? So therefore, it is unnecessary as to why it is necessary. It's unclear as to why it is necessary to like manipulate social media to just get the impact that they want and like completely risk your integrity, to completely risk your reputation as a movement, right? I want to make this clear. This is really bad because progressivism isn't just a movement, but almost all important movements like feminism and social and civil rights and environment, right? But then they talk about echo chambers. Three things. First, we explained how conservatives hop to other platforms, for example, Trump's app, after he got banned from Twitter. Many conservative people flocked to that platform and conglomerated together to create an extremely radical and worse echo chamber. But second, the reason why neutral people will become conservative is because not all conservative people believe in Donald Trump's stuff 100%, right? Not all conservatives believe in whatever, not all misogynists believe in whatever Andrew Tate says 100%. But the difference is that on our side, on their side, you have far more evidence and far more experience of a social media company who you thought was neutral isn't, and is now going against you, right? And is now trying to secretly brainwash you and wipe out your entire ideology, right? As I've said earlier, when people start finding out such patterns, they're going to start pointing this out, and therefore people are going to be much more skeptical of the progressive movement because they're seen as liars, and conservative people are seen as the truth. And this acts as a tipping point that will just cascade into worse impacts. But third, let's be charitable and say that people are going to be more aware. I think just because conservative people are going to see more liberal content, it doesn't mean that they're going to immediately believe in it, right? In comparison, we explained how structurally they're going to be more angry. So in the comparison, we win. Therefore, the reason why backlash is so terrible is twofold. First, it's more likely not going to be terrorizing minorities like white supremacist attacks, right? These extremists will do more extreme things when they get really angry. But second, even if slightly conservative people now become more irrational and now support Trump, whereas they're less likely to support them because of certain things, because he does things like racial supremacism and like sexism, now they're going to be so angry that they're going to support irrational leaders like Trump. On their side, they polarize the progressive and conservatives. On our side, we comparatively have more healthy discussions, and this works given the analysis that in Kevin's speech about how they actually have the incentive to do this, right? On our side, sure, progressivism isn't perfect, and sure, there's some content where conservative, but I think conservatives and liberal people can still debate together, right? The social media companies have an incentive to allow people to debate because they want viewers to stay on their platform and constantly check it, right? And therefore they want them to stay hooked and addicted. And in order to get people to get hooked and addicted, they want to create more arguments and fights. Organic change is the best thing you can have because first, it's the most principally correct thing because they're the ones that made the conscious choice to believe in a certain thing. But second, nobody is going to be skeptical of your integrity as a movement, right? On their side, you completely undermine their reputation. On our side, you actually logically convince people and make it so much clearer for everyone to believe in progressivism. For all these reasons, I'm so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition whip for that speech. Now I'd like to invite the opposition reply to close the case for the opposition side as a whole. Hear, hear.
If everyone is ready, then my time starts now. Proposition in this debate sends itself into a logical dilemma when they try to claim two things at the same time. They either claim that nobody is believing in progressivism right now, and so none of their policy will actually succeed because nobody is going to be supporting their stance. Or they actually agree to reality that progressivism is being spread right now. In that case, they have zero arguments. Three questions I want to discuss in my speech. First of all, what is the status quo? They seem to be living in 2015, literally. Logic-wise, I think it is generally true, as my third speaker tells you, that the Democratic Party exists. And on both sides, there are going to be some powerful people that are able to use money and resources to leverage more news and more popularity. We can concede that maybe if their case stands, that they get a little more new like billionaires. I'm not sure why that matters as of a fact. Second of all, we get progressive popularity uniquely on our side because I think in the status quo, it is a general consensus that human rights and equality for LGBTQ is morally acceptable. That means that more people of the newer generations are willing to join progressivism. But even if you don't buy logic, look at reality. We told you there is BLM and Me Too, etc., that is really, really popular right now. We told you that Joe Biden, he's the president of the United States. They say that in some Southeast Asian, really, really less developed countries, liberals are being beaten to death. We say it doesn't have a matter to do with the topic because in those countries, probably their policy isn't going to be implemented either way. So at the end of the day, no matter if it's logic-wise or reality-wise, I think progressivism is the general trend. Biden's principle, look at reality. Second of all, which side gets the better balance of polarization? We told you that for the conservative people, they have a higher probability to get aroused, to get angry, and in most extreme cases, to even go set up their own social media platforms, as Donald Trump did. With truth, he did get followers. So their logical responses don't really go against reality. But note that each and every one of them is an impact in and of itself. Even if we just believe that the conservatives are going to be more angry, we think that leads already to more radical discussions and more radical policies in the Senate as example. But let's talk about the neutral people that they like this lot. We told you that first of all, that they give the conservatives the principal high ground. The conservatives can literally claim in countries that are liberal, that care a lot about equality and freedom, that the progressive people are taking away freedom, that the progressive people are stripping them of the right of the First Amendment. They give the conservatives the principal high ground. But second of all, I think there's first suspicion in the neutral people because now the neutral people all know that social media is controlled by the progressive people. They are less likely to believe what they perceive as propaganda, so they get less awareness. Third of all, let's talk about the discussion of truth. Note we literally see no response here when when first, second, and third speaker all told you about how discussion of truth only happens when there's two parties or more parties. Because if you only agree to one another, then nobody's going to find the effort to try to find more warranting, more evidence, etc., because there's no need of persuasion. So discussion only happens on our side. That's easily the biggest impact of this debate, because we think that BLM, that LGBTQ, that all kinds of social awareness rise from discussion. But let's take them at their best again and ignore our discussion argument. At worst, we get our argument of them ignoring the things that the conservatives care about. That looks like inflation. That looks like elderly care. So at best, on their case, they're sacrificing these impacts. And at best, that is a wash then. So let's take their sides as the same, right? Because at best, they can argue to you that they get some more awareness on social media. But presumably, according to their case, awareness never matters. Because when it comes to the actual governmenting level, the conservatives somehow still have the higher hand. So they, at best, can tell us how they get more exposure, but they haven't proven to us throughout 3 speeches why exposure leads to more real-world changes. They fundamentally live in an ivory tower. We fundamentally care about reality because we think that our stance spurs the better development of truth. We spur a positive stereotype towards the progressive movement, and we have more care towards everybody and not just a specific entitled group. It is for these reasons we are so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition reply for that speech, and I'd like to invite the government reply to close the case for the government side and close the debate as a whole. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Panel, there's a fundamental reason why African Americans are still being discriminated against in the workplace, why women are still predominantly housewives, and why LGBTQ people are still hide their sexual identity out of shame from social backlash. Just because you believe in Democrat policies doesn't mean support these social movements. Minorities are getting abused. So proud to oppose. Several clarifications we have run to the major clashes in this debate. Firstly, our opponent has very black and white ideology in this debate. This debate is about Democrats versus Republicans. It's on the majority and the powerful populace versus the weak minorities. Notice that our opponent's case relies on all conservatives being extremists. Political ideologies extend the spectrum. A lot of people who identify as conservatives can still get sweeteners in the House. Not all conservatives are going to automatically hate these movements, which is very likely they're still going to donate to help these movements. Only the most extremist conservatives will become the angry conservatives that try to argue on this the House. Secondly, I think our opponent is the one that's greatly strawmanning our case here. What we told you is two things that are really strawmanning. Firstly, this debate was never about liberalism and conservatism. Like if old people are more rich, this debate and what Chingwei told you from the top of her speech is about things like populism, where no matter what stance you take, politicians in the USA, that Europe have large incentives to scapegoat on the minority to stabilize their power and control. For example, scapegoating LGBTQ in Turkey or like refugees when it's literally a refugee crisis, right? That is a problem. The security status quo is a populace actually abusing the minorities. Secondly, no, the status quo is not that liberalism is more the individuals are more liberal and accepting. You have right-wing nationalism, you have more populism, and moves like BLM and Me Too already faded out. There's not really a liberal trend here, and BLM and Me Too really didn't create any policy changes because conservative people also in charge of like political capital and also the social power, and frankly told you what's important for both influencing the political ideology of the younger individuals and with the social media stances. So moving on then, what did our opponents come into the House? Firstly, on the case of conservative being aggravated, we told you two things here. Number one, I think they really need a reality check. People are going to stay on social media platforms anyways because the algorithms are very supportive and very friendly. You don't see a lot of people on Donald Trump's sites, and you have a lot more and you see like a vast majority of people so using boycott Twitter and status quo. Secondly, at their best, we believe this impact is really minimal because only the most extreme conservatives are going to be changed under the House. If their case that most people are progressive is true, this argument really fades out as well, which shows that most people's political ideologies is on the spectrum and they're still going to actively support our policies. And if they're like the vast majority problem here, that people are not aware, right? But even for the conservative people who agree with some like economic policies of conservative individuals, we believe that they can still be swayed. And for like even more neutral individuals, they're still going to have the probability of getting swayed to the House. You just need to give them awareness, just need to tell them the problem. Second argument then, on polarization. Two things here. Number one, we found that very unlikely to switch platforms anyways. Like if they don't believe in progressive content, they're just more likely to ignore the targeted ads anyways because they're not intrigued, right? But for the individuals who are intrigued, they're more likely to click into the title. Secondly, even if they do leave, it's going to be only extreme conservatives because the vast majority of people, conservative individuals, who are not extreme, they're very unlikely to their mass powerful platforms like Google or Twitter, for example, and go to Donald Trump's site, which in the status quo is lacking individuals anyways. Thirdly, on the principle, we told you that conservative people are more powerful collectively and politically, and even if a lot of liberal people have misunderstandings on minority individuals. BLM and Me Too movements are actually cherry examples because they're the most successful by far, and neither of them actually created political changes. Police systems are not structurally reformed in the status quo, and sexual abuse is still a giant issue in the status quo. So this entire argument falls apart. At the end of the day, we're the only side that gets awareness from the conservatives, which is the only people that our opponent relying on the block of their case. Our opponent fundamentally failed to respond to our major argument, which is populism actually abuse of minorities, and starting to mischaracterize this debate from the conservative individuals of the weakened status quo. And now last, they fail to tell you why they have any possibility of getting the social changes to helping minorities we're so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank both teams for that wonderful debate. I would now encourage both teams to cross floor, shake hands, and leave this room so then the three judges can discuss. And do we then announce in the main room hall, or do we announce here?
We'll probably announce in the mail hall.
Okay,
along with
that's
the
great.
order.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.